I'd like to welcome you all again to our second speaker series of 2024. So this is the third year of us doing this speaker series program, a lot out of the university, but some in the out of the Missoula Public Library as well, bringing community members to share a little bit about their expertise with us. So tonight's speaker is going to be Carver Butterfield. He's going to be talking to us about his master's work in Pattee Creek. But before we're able to hear from Carver, we got to get the little WEN introduction out of the way here. So if you're not familiar with the Watershed Education Network, we are a 501c3 nonprofit here in Missoula, whose mission is to foster knowledge, awareness, and appreciation of watershed health through citizen science, youth and school engagement, and outreach to our communities in order to grow future stewards. So we do that with a variety of programs with adults and youth. So my name is Steffi Novak. I'm our stream team coordinator here, and I realized I should have said that before I started talking, but that's okay. Introductions are good whenever you can get them in. So I run a lot of our adult field programs, the largest of those being our stream team program. So every Sunday in the fall, we go out to some of the various creeks around this area, mostly the Rattlesnake Creek, and last year we added Grant Creek to our sampling set. And we take volunteers from the wider community, a lot of university students, just general folks that may or may not have any sorts of background in scientific monitoring. And we take them out into the field, train them on how to do our scientific monitoring to a level that we can actually share our data with a variety of partners and use it as valuable scientific data, even though it's collected by people that may not have that scientific background. And so we have a variety of protocols that we do in the field looking at wider stream health. We're able to take those methods and teach them to a K-12 audience as well. So our youth and school programs cover K-12 programming and some pre-K, some like homeschool groups and a variety of different folks. And we go into classrooms and teach them about stream and riparian health, groundwater techniques, and various topics about kind of the wider scientific community. So another one of our programs for high school students that we're really excited about is our Backcountry Stream Corps. So Backcountry Stream Corps is a 2-week-long program in the summer, and we take out a nice group of about 6 high school students from various high schools around the Missoula area, and we go into the Rattlesnake Creek and Grant Creek and do both our stream team sampling, and we do a lot of large woody debris surveys. So these students are able to get in the creek, get into waders, and they spend all day kind of tromping up the creek, looking at beaver habitat and in-stream wood and seeing how that kind of affects those different streams there. And so if you know any high schoolers, we are actively recruiting for Backcountry Stream Corps. It's a really unique position because it is both stipended, so they will get a $200 stipend at the end of it, as well as like provided lunches and all that sort of fun stuff. But it is also just a day program, so they're able to return home at night, unlike some of the other programs around. So they're able to mountain bike up to our sites, be in the stream, learn these scientific hands-on methods, and then return home at night, which is very nice for both them and for us. So if you know anyone, yeah, we don't really like to camp out with them, but it might be a fun one at some point. If you know anybody though, we have the application up on our website. You can just send them to there, and we'd be more than happy to have them along with us. So a couple of our other programs that we've got going on is our Backyard Citizen Science program. So this is a really unique program in that we give different community members scientific like kits, and you get a kit full of different monitoring equipment, things like measuring tapes, thermometers, little like bug nets, ID keys, things like that. And these families can go out with this kit and an instruction booklet, and they can actually do monitoring in their backyard. And so that booklet kind of walks them through how to do that sort of monitoring, and then they can take all those different tools and actually see what it looks like to do kind of science wherever they're at. So one of our other adult programs though, that we're going to be starting up really quick here is our groundwater monitoring. So in Greeno Park in the Rattlesnake, there's a system of 15 groundwater wells, and we go out about once a month to measure the groundwater elevation at those wells. So because we haven't had much of a winter, we're gonna be able to get out there a lot sooner than we have been in previous years. So keep an eye out on our website, social media, that sort of stuff. But once all the mud kind of clears up a little bit more, we're gonna get out there into Greeno and start actually measuring that groundwater elevations. So all of our programs are meant for this citizen science approach. So you don't have to have any background, any experience. You can just come out and join us on an afternoon and just walk around Greenland Park with us. So our final kind of large program that we've got going on is, of course, our winter speaker series. So we've had a variety of topics that are all recorded, all up on our YouTube that you can go take a look at, as well as, of course, the one that we're going to be doing tonight. We also have, oh, I'm getting ahead of myself there. Yeah, so we have that winter speaker series. Those kits that I was talking about, that low left-hand corner is what those look like. And then here's one of our groundwater tapes in the right here. So these are just a couple of our upcoming events. Of course, you guys know about the speaker series because you've made it here tonight. We also have various programming that we're doing with high school students. The RISE Summit is coming up with these students are able to have projects and they get nice funding from FEMA to implement these projects, and they present them at a huge summit to kind of share what they've been working on. It's kind of like a science fair kind of on steroids sort of thing, but they get money to implement these projects and they compete for kind of challenge money as well. So just a little plug for next speaker series. It's going to be the same location, maybe not this room, but like down the hall, like 1 or 2 doors. But we're going to be hosting a panel on Smurfit Stone. Right now, the presenters are including Elena Evans and Jen Harrington. You might have heard of these folks. They're kind of big names around town. So definitely kind of join us next week, or sorry, next month. Getting, wow, really ahead of myself there. Yep, if you RSVP'd tonight, you are already RSVP'd for the next one if you signed up there, but you can always fill that out again if you're kind of unsure there. So with that, does anybody have any questions about when or what we do or anything? Nice. There's quite a few WEN staff and interns floating around. Just snag us if you have any questions like that, and we'll be more than happy to talk to you about anything that we're working on. But now we're going to get to the heart of what you guys actually really came here to hear about tonight, which is Carver Butterfield's work in Pattee Creek. So I'm going to give Carver a little bit of an introduction here, and then we're going to have him up here. So Carver Butterfield is a geography master's student at the University of Montana. After graduating from MSU in 2020 with a bachelor's in earth science and geographic information systems, Carver moved to Missoula to serve as a Montana Conservation Corps fellow with the City of Missoula Stormwater Utility. His primary responsibility in this position was to map the stormwater infrastructure and urban waterways of Missoula. After his fellowship ended, Carver was hired as a full-time city employee, where among other duties, he was responsible for conducting water sampling along the rivers and creeks of Missoula. During his 3 years working with the city, he became fascinated with how humans interact with the waterways they depend on. Carver also developed burning curiosities and questions regarding the creeks of Missoula, specifically Pattee Creek. He came up with a research project to help answer some of these questions, which he's currently researching for his master's thesis, which he plans to defend in May. So I want to have you guys all help me welcome Carver Butterfield to our presentation.
Sweet. So as Steffi said, thank you for the great introduction, Steffi. My name is Carver, and today I'm going to be presenting on my master's thesis, which is titled From Creek to Ditch and Back Again, the History and Future of Pattee Creek. So we can just get right into it. So I'm going to be talking about the research that I've been conducting over the past 3-ish years, which is broken up into 3 categories. The first one being Geographic Information Systems Investigation, otherwise known as GIS, and then also water quality analysis. So I have data from the City of Missoula and Missoula County, which I'm going to be talking to you guys today about. And then finally, I did some interviews with some residents and also some employees with the city and the county, which we're going to talk about. So yeah, it should be pretty groovy, and I'm stoked. Thanks for coming. Thanks for having me. All right. So to build off of Steffi's introduction, just a little bit more about me. I started working for the stormwater utility in 2020, and throughout the duration of my employment, I worked a lot with Pattee Creek specifically. So I did a lot of sampling along the creek. I did mapping along the creek, talked to people about the creek. I pulled lids from the middle of the streets with a flamethrower, which was pretty fun. All sorts of stuff. And I developed a curiosity and a concern for Pattee Creek that helped kind of fuel this project. And another thing is I just really love water a lot. And I love the water of Missoula specifically. And I surf a lot and snorkel and swim. And every time I fall on my surfboard, I take a big gulp of Clark Fork water, accidentally, not on purpose. But so I'm like concerned about water quality just in general because it impacts my daily life and it impacts the critters that I love and the people I love. So yeah, this is a picture of Pattee Creek. I live close to the creek and I come here a lot and I love the turtles a lot. So yeah, I'm stoked about Pattee Creek and that's what fueled this as well. Okay, on to the stuff that you came here for. This is Pattee Creek Watershed, and we have the headwaters of Pattee Creek in between Mount Sentinel and Mount Deanstone. So in this area, snow falls, rain falls, and then the creek flows down through Pattee Canyon and comes into contact with the city of Missoula urban boundary. So the first main piece, the first main piece of infrastructure that Pattee Creek comes into contact with is the grit chamber, which is a stormwater detention pond located at the corner of Higgins and Pattee Canyon Road. So Pattee Creek flows into the grit chamber and it exits in two pipes. One pipe is a 60-inch diameter pipe that flows all the way to the Bitterroot River. Another pipe is smaller and flows into an open channel, which leads to Bancroft Ponds. And Bancroft Ponds is, as I said, a really cool urban wetland with lots of cool wildlife. And it's also the last place that Pattee Creek is above ground before it enters into another pipe, which leads to the other 60-inch gravity main and flows all the way to the Bitterroot River. And another spot I'll be talking about today is Cattail Corner, which is a urban wetland. This is Russell and 39th. And then, yeah, so this is fed by High Park drainage, which is an intermittent tributary of Pattee Creek. And it's actually separate from Pattee Creek. Pattee Creek runs down Russell right here. But after water passes through Cattail Corner, it goes back into Pattee Creek. And the final spot that I'll be talking about today is the confluence. So this just refers to where Pattee Creek and Bitterroot meet each other. So Pattee Creek exits that 60-inch diameter pipe right here, flows through an open swale on its way to Bitterroot River. So that's the general area. Okay, so before we go any further into the present day history, it's important to acknowledge the cultural history of this landscape. So the Salish and Pend Oreille people have been living here for thousands of years, and the original Salish word for Pattee Canyon means the valley where two ravines meet. So this is referring to that area that Deer Creek comes into contact with the Pattee Creek drainage. And this is a culturally important place because when it was time for the Salish people to migrate east to the buffalo hunting grounds, they would go up and over Pattee Creek and Pattee Canyon on a trail, sometimes to avoid the treacherous Hellgate Canyon. And aside from being an important transportation route, the low-lying sections of the watershed were also important bitterroot harvest locations. The creek itself was obviously very valuable. A Pend Oreille elder, Mitch Small Salmon, once described his people as wealthy from the water, which just illustrates the really deep connection between indigenous peoples and water on this landscape that has been around for a long time and exists still today. So in 1865, I have like so many dates in my brain, so I think I got the right one. 1865, David Pattee settled in Missoula. That was the beginning of permanent colonial settlement in Missoula, and he built his homestead right about there on the image at the base of Pattee Canyon. And shortly after that, in 1877, Fort Missoula was built, which is where that star is located. And after Fort Missoula was built, the upper regions of the watershed, which is right around here, was designated as a timber reserve. So this is when extractive land management practices were implemented on the landscape for the first time. And with logging, we also saw some farming in the lower reaches of the watershed. So that would be wheat, barley, vegetables, things like that. So as you can see from that map, this map of Pattee Creek looks a lot different than the Pattee Creek that we know today. So before irrigation diversions, Pattee Creek actually used to turn towards the north and feed the Clark Fork River back in the day. And we know this because when you look at a digital elevation model, that's the way that the slope goes. And then also Harriet Johnston, who was super cool. In 1916, she started her PhD dissertation on the ecology of the Missoula region, and she described a bunch of the different, or all the different creeks and streams and rivers of Missoula. And when she describes the Clark Fork, she says, the rattlesnake empties into it, and further west, it receives the waters of Pattee Creek. So realistically, back in these days, Pattee Creek would hit the valley floor and kind of braid out in multiple channels, and it would probably migrate from year to year. But as she describes, reaching the Clark Fork River. So this is the beautifully written document that Harriet Johnston wrote, which was impossible for me to decipher because I didn't pay attention in elementary school apparently, and I don't know how to read cursive that well. So shout out to the librarian who helped me read this. Another quote is, Pattee Creek has its rise at the head of Pattee Canyon. It's a clear, sparkling stream about 4 feet wide. Along its banks, the vegetation is green and abundant. So she also goes into a really nice long description of the different plants, animals, fish, birds that live in and near Pattee Creek. And a lot of those species still live there. Okay, as I said, the present day watershed looks a lot different. And this is because of a bunch of different things, but mainly diversions and piping and ditching. So on the right, we have this present day map, and then we have old aerial imageries just to be able to show you guys where we're looking. So this image right here is from 1937. So the grit chamber would be right here. Oh, you can't see my thing. The grit chamber would be right there. And then this is Pattee Canyon Road. And then this would be Higgins going up right there. So we see some diversions in place. So in between 1916 and 1937, the creek was sent to the west towards the Bitterroot River, which is what we're seeing, this little diversion. And then in the 50s, we see some houses cropping up. So southern Missoula experienced rapid urban growth in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And houses were built directly next to the creek. Anyone think of any potential issues that would cause? Yeah.
Accidental gray water or black water discharge.
Maybe. I don't know. Yeah, flooding. That's the big one. And plenty of others. But yeah, so flooding. There was no floodplain at all conserved along Pattee Creek and no riparian buffer. So not surprisingly, this resulted in pretty significant flooding, which happened almost annually during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Pattee Creek would flood to different extents, but this all boiled over in 1980. So in 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted and caked the Missoula Valley floor in ash. And that ash clogged a lot of the drains across the valley. And then shortly after the eruption, there was a really intense storm event. So that storm event put rain on snow in the upper reaches of Watershed and then made Pattee Creek flood. So this is a image taken after the flood. We can see in red. It's kind of hard to see on the image, but the streets are flooded. There's a bunch of houses that got damaged, and people were scared and people were concerned. So in response, the city and the county teamed up and built the Missoula South Hills Storm Drainage System, which was built from 1982 to 2002, costed $11.8 million, and that number has been added to because there's more additions to it. It's a complex system of pipes, basins, and channels that are designed to convey a 100-year flood event of Pattee Creek. So this system effectively reduced the flooding, pretty much eliminated it in southern Missoula, but it also buried Pattee Creek, created a bunch of maintenance issues, and didn't really have a good conservation ethic in mind. So here's an image of what Pattee Creek would have looked like before the pipes were put in place. So this is what I say when it's an annual occurrence of Pattee Creek coming up, city employees having to go out and put sandbags on the creek. And then, yeah, it was a big issue and a result of poor planning. But now, Pattee Creek, this is that same location where the channel is. And now there's a 60-inch diameter pipe where that blue line is that runs down the street and conveys Pattee Creek during high water and also other times of year. yeah, so some places in the valley, the creek or the channel was preserved and the creek still is above ground. But in other places, it was completely removed. So this top picture is right after Bancroft Ponds when Pattee Creek was in an open channel. And now it's running underneath in that purple line. So here's a map of the system, which is a total cluster and kind of hard to look at. But the purple lines are all the pipes. And as you can see, it's a very modified system with a lot of different inputs coming in from a lot of different places. And this system costs the city of Missoula a lot of money to maintain every year. So there's a ton of sediment that builds up in these channels and in these pipes, which require regular maintenance. So this is a picture of what the channel looks like. And this channel that feeds Bancroft Ponds is controlled by a gate. So the city can turn the water off to go in and do maintenance. And maintenance looks like this, using a vacuum truck or a hydro jetter to suck out the sediment that builds up in the creek. So this is a consequence of when you don't let a creek do its thing and you ditch it and pipe it. Okay, so that's the introduction onto the GIS investigation. So, oh, I need to drink water. That's one of my plans. Okay. So my first question is, what did Pattee Creek look like before urbanization occurred in southern Missoula? Second, how has the flow path of Pattee Creek changed? And third, since the onset of urban growth in southern Missoula, how has the land cover in the Pattee Creek watershed changed? So the methods for this whole section are pretty intense, and I'm not going to go into every detail, but I can take questions at the end if people want to know more. Basically, I created watershed boundaries, generated orthomosaics, mapped the channel, and classified land cover. So the first step was to create the watershed boundary, which is pretty easy and a natural catchment because you can use a digital elevation model, which is this right here, to predict where water is going to flow based off of elevation data. But it gets a little bit tricky in an urban setting because the watersheds have water from one place and they're artificially modified to bring it to another. So I used a combination of high resolution digital elevation models gathered from the USGS and DNRC. I brought that into ArcMap, created flow direction and flow accumulation data sets. And then finally, I used some hand digitization techniques to make watershed boundaries that account for urban development. The second step was I created some orthomosaics, which is a fancy term, but it basically just means a quilt of aerial imagery. So aerial imagery comes in these raw files that are not stitched together and not georeferenced. And process is done in a bunch of different programs. I use Agisoft Metashape, and this is what a clump of aerial pictures would look like. So these are from 1937. And these were actually originally film rolls that were gathered from the University of Montana Library. So the first step was to scan the film. And then the second step was to bring it into Agisoft and stitch it together. And this is what one of those orthomosaics looks like. So you can see the program is stretching the images in some places to account for the distortion of the 3D surface of Earth, which is pretty neat. Okay, so this is what the orthomosaic looked like. So here's that clump of images I showed you, and these went into making that little part of the orthomosaic. So you can kind of see what goes into this. And this is the 1935 orthomosaic. So it's titled 35 because most of the images were from 1935, but some of them were from 37. I just called it 35 because it was easier than putting both of the names. And yeah, as you can see, it didn't cover the entire study area because there's not that many photos from this period. But thankfully, for the other years, I did get enough good imagery to cover the whole study area, which allowed me to map the whole valley portion of the stream. So this portion of the stream I didn't map because one, it didn't change that much, and two, I couldn't see it because the trees would cover it in the upper reaches. So I only mapped the lower portion of Pattee Creek, so starting at the city boundary right there. And yeah, so as I flip through these orthomosaics, keep an eye on forest cover, and also how the stream channel is changing. So by the 70s, we see some logging taking place in the upper reaches of the watershed, and then continued urban development down low, and the stream becoming more and more channelized. In 1984 was the lowest amount of forested land in the upper reaches of the watershed, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. We see some more houses being built, the stream becoming more and more channelized, continuing that trend into 1995. So we can see this little part of the orthomosaic is a little bit blurry. So some images are better quality than others. So that's why this one looks a little bit different than the others. Here's 2005, some revegetation taking place across the upper reaches of the watershed. And then finally 2019, and this is the most recent orthomosaic. And this was just gathered from NAPE imagery, so the orthomosaic was already made for these last 2 years. Okay, so for each year, I mapped the channel, which you guys saw in those previous maps. And this is the first one. This is 1935. So in this image, we can see the evidence of the braided channel of Pattee Creek, what it used to look like after the initial diversion was put in, but before it was put into a irrigation ditch further down. But then that blue line is the wetted center line of Pattee Creek as it was in 1935. So we can see it's a naturally looking meandering stream across the valley floor, and still looks like that in 55 with some houses cropping up. Still looks like that mostly in 1964. We see the creek being put into a pipe right where that straight line is up there, but mostly free flowing. And then 1972, we start to see some pretty intense channelization. The creek being put into a pipe where that straight line is through the houses, and then being straightened out a lot right there. And then also some man-made meanders being put in on the upper right there. Same thing in the 80s. This image was a little bit blurry. In the 90s, even straighter, less natural looking. And this is a picture from this time. So this is what Pattee Creek would have looked like in 1995. So we can see people mowing up right near the creek, and yeah, it looks kind of like a ditch. So this is what Russell Park West would have looked like during this year. You can see the creek right there. So in between 1995 and 2005, that's when that 60-inch gravity main was put in. So on this image, all of the blue is underground. So Russell to this day runs down, or Pattee to this day runs down Russell, takes it right on 39 on its way to Bittery River. And one thing I forgot to point out is that the Cattail Corner is right here. You can see that it's a man-made wetland, and it was put in not really there in the 70s or 80s, but put in, and there it is today. Okay. Nice. Oh gosh. Oh, wait, I missed that. Okay, so Russell Park West today, as you can see, does not have the creek flowing over it. That's the same picture that it had previously. Okay, so the key takeaways from mapping the channel is that Pattee Creek used to be a braided stream that meandered across the valley, and now it has been heavily channelized, ditched, and piped. So the next section was land cover. The National Land Cover Database, otherwise known as the NLCD, is a coarse resolution data set that gives information on the land cover of the entire United States, and they have a bunch of different categories. What I did is I took this data set and I simplified it. So I combined all of the developed land into one category. That's including medium intensity, low intensity, open space, and high intensity. I combined all the forested categories, which was just 2 that fell in Pattee Creek, watershed, evergreen, and mixed. And then I also combined the agriculture and open land categories into just a general open land category. And I used these 3 categories to quantify the land cover change of the Pattee Creek watershed over time. So The red is developed, the green is forest. So we can see more developed land coming across the landscape, and then some logging taking place in the upper reaches of the watershed. So as I said, 1984 was the lowest amount of forested land in the upper reaches of the watershed. And this is important because this is also when the most intense flooding was in the lower reaches. So if we remember back to Hydrology 101, when you remove trees from a watershed, you remove their ability to transpire water and you increase the runoff of streams. So as we were cutting down trees in the upper watershed, we were building impervious surfaces lower down, which kind of contributed to that flooding that we saw. And then we see some revegetation occurring in 2005 and in 2019. So key takeaways from the land cover is that developed land has increased and forested land has fluctuated due to logging and fire. There's also some fires in the upper reaches of the watershed that contributed to the forested land decreasing. And then also, I mean, one of the main reasons I looked at land cover is because land cover is a really important metric for understanding water quality, which leads me to my next section. So the water quality analysis, I had two questions that helped guide this. First one being, where does Pattee Creek experience the highest water quality impairments? And does Pattee Creek have significantly worse water quality than Grant Creek and Rattlesnake Creek? If so, why? And this is me looking at Excel sheets for the past 2 years. Okay, so a little bit of a background before I get into it. So there's 3 parameters that I looked at. Total nitrogen, which is all types of nitrogen, organic and inorganic. Total phosphorus, same thing for phosphorus. And these 2 nutrients are known to increase in urban catchments. So when we urbanize our landscape, we increase the concentration of nutrients from a bunch of different sources. Some of the main ones being fertilizer. So fertilizer is put down on lawns, which contributes to the enrichment of nitrogen and phosphorus. We have dog waste, which also does the same thing. And then leaky septic sewage, septic systems, which is also known to do that. And then the other one is total suspended solids that I looked at, which is the total amount of solid particles that are suspended in water. And similarly, when you increase developed land, you increase the amount of TSS. And this can be done through construction activities, putting road sand down, flinging mud off your Tacoma truck when you drive it around Missoula, all sorts of different things. So yeah, I got water quality data from 2 sources. So the Missoula Stormwater Utility and the Missoula Valley Water Quality District. I can go into the details of this more if people want, but moving on, this is a map of, you couldn't tell I love maps, and I like any excuse to make a map. I'm like, let's go. But okay, so this is all the different sample sites of the watersheds. So we have 5 in Pattee Creek, 4 in Rattlesnake Creek, 3 in Grant Creek. And for total nitrogen, okay, so I have a bunch of graphs here, and there's a couple things to keep in mind when you're looking at these graphs. One, the y-axis is on a logarithmic scale. So that means the distance between 10 and 1 is 10 times greater than the distance between 0.1 and 1. So keep that in mind. And then also this dashed line right here is the Montana Department of Environmental Quality Nutrient Standard. So that standard is set at a level that's intended to protect beneficial uses. So when water is above that standard, it's indicative of an impairment. And as we can see, most of the Pattee Creek data is above that standard. And also through statistical tests, I found that Pattee Creek consistently experienced elevated levels of total nitrogen compared to the other 2. I also looked at how total nitrogen compared to percent developed land. So I wanted to do this to be able to see how the concentration of pollutants were moving or changing as you move through the watershed. So that first sample site, okay, on this graph, there are 3 different colors. The red is Pattee Creek, green is Grant Creek, and blue is Rattlesnake. And the first sample site in the Pattee Creek watershed corresponds to that first clump of data on Pattee Creek. So this is the Barmeyer Trailhead sample site. The second one is a Hillcrest Loop sample site. The third is the Grit Chamber and then we have Bancroft, and finally the confluence. And as you can see, as you move through the watershed, the concentration of nitrogen increases. So I fit this data to a generalized linear model, which gave me a strong positive correlation between percent developed land and total nitrogen in Pattee Creek and Grant Creek, and then an insignificant correlation in Rattlesnake Creek. That is probably because in Rattlesnake Creek, you have other things influencing total nitrogen, like natural, biologic, geologic processes. Also, there's just such a low amount of percent developed land in Rattlesnake Creek, so it's not influencing it as much. For total phosphorus, I found similar things. Pattee Creek higher than the other two. And I also looked at how phosphorus changes with percent developed land and found the same trend with Grant Creek and Rattlesnake Creek. Interestingly, at this first sample site at Barmeyer Trailhead, all the data points are above that nutrient standard, which is at 0.03 for phosphorus. It's at 0.3 for nitrogen, but they're different parameters. So this is probably because in the upper reaches of the watershed, there's a lot of old septic sewage systems that are leaking into the creek, which is not ideal, but that's what we're dealing with. But also, as you move through the watershed, the amount of phosphorus increases. Sweet, on to TSS. So TSS, I found the same thing, consistently higher rates of TSS in Pattee Creek than the other two. And similarly, I found that as you move through the watershed, TSS increases in Grant Creek and in Pattee Creek and not in Rattlesnake. And this really does make sense when you consider how much road sand we put down throughout the Pattee Creek watershed. And the steep South Hills roads, we put a bunch of dirt on the road, which washes into the creek. This is what the confluence of Pattee Creek looks like. So this is the very end of the creek. You have some sediment laden water in a beer can for good measure. And yeah, this is what it looks like entering the river. So I saw this pretty regularly when I was working for the city. And I was like shocked. I was like, what? Why is this happening? How did it get to this point? And that's kind of another thing that inspired this project. So key takeaways, we have elevated levels of TN, TP, and TSS in Pattee Creek compared to Grant and Rattlesnake. The low sections of Pattee Creek see the highest concentrations of pollutants. And finally, developed land is strongly correlated with these parameters in Grant Creek and Pattee Creek. And that last point is significant because if we know that developed land is correlated with these water quality impairments, we can aim policies at trying to reduce the impact of developed land. So that could be green infrastructure, low impact development, things like that. Okay, good job for hanging in there. We got one more section, which is the interview section. And there were 3 questions that helped inspire this. First, what are the impacts of disconnecting a creek from a community? So throughout my employment with the city, I talked to a lot of people, and I just noticed that the city of Missoula and the Missoula community was less connected to Pattee Creek than other creeks, which is not surprising given that most of it is underground in the urban boundary. So I was interested in that. I wanted to explore that. And then also I noticed the cycle of degradation and neglect that was happening along Pattee Creek. And I was hoping that with these interviews, I could kind of try to identify ways to help break that cycle down and how to reverse it. And then finally, depending on who you talk to and where you talk to them, some people will consider Pattee Creek a creek or a conveyance or a ditch or stormwater. And I kind of wanted to dive into that and talk more about it. And this is just a picture of where Pattee Creek runs under 39th. So I talked to 20 residents of Missoula with the public intercept method, which is just so well named. It's exactly what it is. I just went up to someone and started talking to them. And then I also did some key informant interviews with some city employees, county employees, and one conservation district employee. So with the residents, I asked them all the same questions, a set of 10 questions. One of the questions I asked was, how do you think your everyday activities impact the creek? And one common theme that I found which feeds into that lack of connection, is a lack of awareness. So one person said, I wouldn't say that my everyday activities impact the creek because I never go over there, which is ironic because this person was standing 20 feet away from the creek and had just driven their car over it. And that's not because this person was oblivious or uneducated. It's a product of our urban development and our urban landscape. So when you look at a map on Google Maps, for example, Pattee Creek mysteriously disappears after Bancroft Ponds. And as it disappears from the maps, it also disappears from our collective consciousness. So another thing that I found really interesting is that people mow up right next to the creek, which is extremely detrimental to water quality, because when you remove vegetation, you're removing the ability of those plants to shield the creek. You're also making it more susceptible to fertilizer pollution and all sorts of other things that are put on lawns, like pesticides. And yeah, so this just shocked me because it's so obviously not what you should be doing. And a lot of people like it and a lot of people do it. And one common justification is that people want to see the creek. So they have this water body in front of their house and they want to be able to see it and enjoy it. Another one that I've heard people talk about is that if vegetation grows, then mountain lions could live in the creek and be dangerous. So there's all sorts of weird things, but a big one is that people don't want to be bad neighbors. And this is how things have been done for years. And people are scared to break the mold. And this practice, among other things, have caused people to describe Pattee Creek as gross and channelized. So while we do have that, we also have a bunch of people who look at Pattee Creek as a sacred escape to nature. And so there's a big difference between how some people perceive and want the creek to look like, and then how other people do. So some people want to see more native riparian vegetation along the creek. People want to bring it back to the surface until it hits the Bitterroot. And you can tell which people I agree with. But thankfully, the tide does seem to be turning on this. It's slow, but we have great government entities like the Missoula Stormwater Utility and the Missoula Conservation District, who have both sponsored some pretty sweet restoration efforts that, there's a long way to go, but at least we're getting the ball rolling on this. And this is what Pattee Creek could look like instead of that monoculture of lawn grass. And this, we have government entities working on it, but we also have community buy-in. So a lot of people want to see it restored back to the natural system. And hopefully we'll start to have the bad neighbors be the ones who mow up right next to the creek. Okay, so before I continue on with the final part of this presentation, I want to pose a question. You can just think about it to yourself. Is this a creek? So on the right, we have below the grit chamber, and on the left, we have above the grit chamber. Okay, so in the regulatory world, above the grit chamber is considered a creek. So this is protected by the Montana Streambed and Land Preservation Act 310 laws, which is enforced by the Missoula Conservation District. And below, it is not considered a creek. It's considered a conveyance or stormwater. And this has really big regulatory ramifications. So this means that pipes that discharge untreated stormwater don't need to be sampled in the same way that they are for Grant Creek and Rattlesnake Creek. Then also, if you do work in the creek or near the creek, you don't need to fill out the same habitat assessment. And basically, Pattee Creek below this point doesn't benefit from the same regulatory protection that other creeks do. And while I say this, it's important to recognize that there's human beings who work for these government entities that don't agree with this classification, but this is the current state of our regulations. So I talked to 3 city employees and got a wide variety of views. One city employee thinks that they should have piped the entire creek. And this person has been working for the city for a long time and saw the creek flood and thinks of it as a pretty significant hazard, which it was. So there's this balance between public safety and ecosystem health that's in the hands of a lot of our government officials and our community in general. So as I said, the streets department puts a bunch of sand down on the road. We pipe our creeks, which helps increase public safety, but it also has a pretty significant cost. Other employees are frustrated with the system, say that we're constantly clearing pipes. We have pinch points that constantly get clogged. And thankfully, people want to see all the daylighted portions fully revegetated. And my favorite one, I would love for people to call it Pattee Creek and not the ditch. I also talked to two Missoula Valley Water Quality District employees, and this government entity is responsible for enforcing the Missoula Valley Water Quality Ordinance, which they do really great work protecting our sole source aquifer. And for each county and city employee, I asked the same question of, is Pattee Creek natural and where does Pattee Creek end? And one person said once it's a built and engineered environment, that's where it's delineated between being a creek and not a creek. And this is a valid perspective because below the grit chamber, that stream is heavily human modified, right? So we have a gate valve that turns it on or off. And there's a bunch of different creeks in Missoula, and it makes sense to not consider lower Pattee Creek a creek to some people in some perspectives. And another person said it would be great if it was separate from the stormwater system and separated from the pipes, which would be awesome. Unfortunately, we have a lot of infrastructure in place that would prevent that from happening. But daylighting is something that communities across the world have been doing, and it's something that Missoula could possibly benefit from in the future. So I also talked to one conservation district employee who explained to me that anything below the grit chamber, we don't take 310 jurisdiction on because it's not a creek. And historically, 310 laws haven't been strictly enforced in the upper reaches of the watershed. And thankfully, this is changing. So our government regulations are really just a reflection of our community values. And since the city and the community of Missoula is starting to care more about Pattee Creek, the Conservation District is also going to start enforcing 310 laws along Pattee Creek. And this is a 3-year plan, so they're not going to go out and start handing out violations today. And the reason being is because, trying to get people to voluntarily change their ways with public education is better than just giving them a fine. Okay, so Pattee Creek used to be a naturally meandering creek that went across the valley. It was a creek long before people got here, and it's going to be a creek long after we're gone. And by conceiving the heavily urbanized Pattee Creek as an unnatural ditch or conveyance, we are reinforcing and justifying our ecologically damaging practices. And I argue that to achieve successful restoration, we should consider the entire creek a creek and ditch the word ditch. Finally, there's a bunch of different species, including humans, that benefit from Pattee Creek. We got turtles, my personal favorite, all types of birds, and also West Slope cutthroat trout. We have 99.9% genetically pure cutthroat trout populations in upper Pattee Creek. So there's a bunch of reasons to invest time and energy to protecting this ecosystem. And the people of the Pattee Creek watershed for millennia have been wealthy from the water, and we should protect Pattee Creek and invest in restoration to tap into this wealth. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to the WEN staff for hosting me. Also, this project took a lot of work, and a lot of people really helped me along the way, including Tracy Campbell with the city, Marie Nelson, Lindsay Holloway, Pat Brooks, Lynn McCammett with Montana View, Scott Powell, Conservation District, Radley Watkins, Brian Vaught, Missoula Valley Water Quality District, Todd Seib, Elena Evans, Calvin D, Sue Tao with the Forest Service, Gina Mazza with the DNRC, Mike Snook with the county, my friends, family, my mom, my dad, Ellen, my girlfriend, who's on Zoom right now and helped me with a bunch of stuff, including artwork for the presentation. And then at the university, Sarah Halverson, Ben Coleman, Natalie Bergson, Mark Fritsch, and Vicki Watson. And finally, my wonderful advisor, Anna Clean, has been super helpful for this whole process. So thank you, Anna. And yeah, that's it. And I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah.
We can just start on Zoom quickly.
Okay.
There was a question that asked, are they still monitoring frog populations in Bancroft Pond?
I don't know. I think Deb would probably know the answer to that more than me.
I am not sure. I
Oh.
probably that one with Vicky.
I have no idea.
I have not heard that anybody is doing that.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't heard of it either. I know that the church that is right on that concrete channel, there's a lot of frogs in that part of the channel, and they've all been really concerned about the frog population because that channel needs to be regularly excavated to remove the sediment. So every time the city goes through and pulls the sediment out of that channel, there's a lot of people who are super concerned about frogs, as they should be, because they get sucked up into a vacuum truck and thrown away. So, but yeah.
It's the only breeding population of all these spotted frogs in the Missoula Valley.
Yeah.
What do they do with the sediment once they pump it out?
They bring it to the Missoula wastewater treatment plant, and they put the sediment on a drying bed, and they allow all the water to drain out to a location that doesn't go to a water body. And then once it's dry, all that sediment gets scooped up and taken to the landfill. Is that roughly accurate? Okay,
They also test it
they test it. Yeah,
for other purposes.
yeah, either one.
So it, that used to run into the, why was it diverted? You know?
Because agriculture, and if it was kept going to the Clark Fork, it would have gone a shorter distance. So by diverting it to the Bitterroot, people who were farming wheat, barley, and vegetables across the Missoula Valley Floor were able to get more water, basically, more land to use it on. Yeah.
I have a question somewhat close to this. Was there any irrigation like infrastructure built on the creek the time that ag was like predominantly taking place in that part of the valley? Before any development, right? So like was the creek, was there any divertments, any irrigation built off of it to supply water to these farms and
Oh yeah. So there was a pretty complex network of irrigation ditches that were diverting Pattee Creek. And I mean, what originally diverted it was a ditch. So someone dug the ditch and then put the creek in it. It's gonna take me so long to go back.
yeah, it's
to
the
the
beginning
beginning.
of your presentation.
No, it's all good. We can have another person ask a question while I get back there. Yeah.
Curious, the calls to turn the ditch back into a creek or like bring it above ground. Would that still have it going to the bitter, or is there any call? Is there like possible at all to put it back in the Clark Park, or is that just like that ship has sailed?
I think that ship has sailed, but
There's a university in the way.
Yeah.
yeah, but there are a lot of places in southern Missoula that could benefit from it. Okay, so I skipped a slide that's going to help me answer that question. Okay, so right, different year actually would be better. So this still looks like this today. It still has open space where this channel used to go. And if you walk right there, you can actually see the old channel of Pattee Creek. Like it's very visible and it's still there. So theoretically, it would cost a lot of money and it would be hard to do, but it's possible that the creek could resurface again.
Is that right next to Albertsons where it does the big loop up there with the Russell?
Yeah, we're looking at 39, no, Russell and 39. So this would be Albertsons. Yeah. And then, okay, wait, I gotta keep up with the questions because the first one I was going back to answer the ditch question. Oh goodness. Okay, so we see this right here. Ditch that Pattee Creek would have been diverted into. Does that kind of help answer your question? So there's
Yeah,
ditches.
more or less like, obviously as time progresses, like more development is happening in the valley.
Yeah.
It seems like the 50s and 60s were like the most robust time of development up until probably more recently, right?
Uh-huh.
So those farms were probably sold, the land was sold to developers to be developed. So I would assume that all the irrigation infrastructure and the additional ditches that came off of the creek were either plowed over or paved on top of and are now homes.
Most of them, yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
And then I just had an additional question.
Yeah.
You had mentioned like deteriorating septic tanks and
Yeah.
also infrastructure. Are the homes that are in this part of the valley that are essentially on top of the Pattee Creek watershed, let's say, do you know if they're connected to the city sewer lines? Are they a mix of like septic
Yeah.
and sewer lines?
Most of them that are in the low lying section of the watershed
Yeah.
are connected to sewer. When I was talking about the old septic systems, that's all in the upper reaches of the watershed. So those houses up there are not connected to city sewer, and they have septic systems. And I've cited that as a potential reason for increased phosphorus levels in the upper reaches of the watershed. Another one would be that there's a lot of grazing that takes place in the upper reaches of the watershed. So we have animals pooping right next to the creek, eating vegetable or eating grass right next to the creek. So that could be causing it too. Yeah, so the septic system leaking into the creek, that's a guess of why those levels could be high. And that's something that experts of local water quality agree with me on. And that's not an original idea of mine. That's something that I've talked to other people about.
Then I have one more and I'll take the questions.
Very good.
The cutthroat that live in the stream above town.
Yeah.
Are they genetically pure essentially because it's kind of like cut off
Yeah.
from the rest of the valley?
That's correct. So they're not entirely genetically pure. They're like 99.9%.
Sure.
And that is because the creek was put into a pipe way back in the day. So no fish were able to get up there. And also back when the creek wasn't put into a pipe, it actually rarely ever even met the Bitterroot River. So mostly it would just die out before it even hit the river. The reason it does all the time now is because we have so much impervious surface. We also have pipes that are taking spring water and feeding it into the creek unnaturally. So we've increased the runoff of Pattee Creek dramatically with our urban development for a bunch of different reasons. But yeah, so they are almost genetically pure. So that's significant. So if there was some restoration effort that was going to take place, maybe they would pick fish from Pattee Creek because it hasn't been contaminated. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Being that Missoula is in a rapid phase of development, and there are a variety of interventions that could probably be in place with land use policy and design qualities, as well as transportation design qualities. What are some interventions that local government could put in place to sort of daylight creek and maybe in a new?
Yeah, in an ideal world, I mean, so I showed you that location where there's still a channel in place. There's also places where the creek runs 10 feet underground of a park. So theoretically, it wouldn't be that challenging to just like rip the pipe up and put the creek on the surface and allow it to flow through a park. So that could be one thing. Obviously, that's pretty expensive, but there's also a ton of really cheap things that we can do. Some communities have painted little lines of like water where a creek is beneath a street to try to just like tell people that it's there. So that's one thing. Another thing is just investing in public outreach. So I think getting the word out to people that this creek still exists and we live on top of it would be a good thing. And finally, I think we need to learn from this situation. So a lot of this is already said and done, right? So there's a lot we can do to help Pattee Creek, but I think a big reason I wanted to do this project and I wanted to highlight this is because it's a really good example of what not to do. Like we should not build right next to creeks. And going forward with any development, that should always be kept in mind. And riparian buffers should be respected and exceeded in all situations, I'd say. Yeah.
Well, I can tell you, it was a very big disappointment to those of us who have been working on some restoration projects as it flowed through various parks. And suddenly the city announced at one point that they were going to do pipe. And we asked all around people who lived on the creek, people who were on the planning board, said, is there any public process that looked at this and described, is this the right thing to do?
Yeah.
When all around the country, there are daylighting creeks that have been put in pipes years ago. And, there was no public process that I was ever able to find. It's just like the city just suddenly decreed that's what it's gonna do, put it in the pipe. And obviously they had, what they could have done was gather the runoff from streets and stuff, put that in the pipe, but not put the creek in, put the street runoff.
Right.
It's just, they thought it would be cheaper thing to do, I guess.
Yeah.
But it seemed to me that if they had gathered the runoff that was increasing the flow of the creek and causing problems, gathered that, put it in a pipe, up the creek, where it's still in a little channel and all the way down to a horse pasture down there.
Yeah.
Literally didn't usually, except during high flow years, it would make it all the way to but this year, like you said, it didn't. So, and the people who had irrigation rights down there, they lost their irrigation rights.
Yeah.
So it's just a weird process, but it really surprised me because it didn't seem like Missoula.
Yeah. So to tie into your question, Charlie, going forward, it would be good to have public processes with these decisions and have community buy-in. Sounds like that was lacking, yeah, for this project. Yeah.
You mentioned the in the history, and you close with a quote from the Siskiyou Elder. Just kind of curious to hear a little bit more in that lens of, like, it really feels to me like this would be the first time that we evaluate Pattee Creek in a way. Not necessarily, you know, that's someone like myself who's settler descended, new to Missoula.
Yeah.
You know, what are some of the barriers and limitations to appreciating the creek kind of in the way you refer to? And then maybe just speak a little bit more, if you could, that lens of like where we're at in this phase of
The barriers are humongous, as you know. I mean, I'm sure you've thought about this a lot, but you know, this environmental planning paradigm is a product of our fundamental different worldview. So we view ourselves as separate from nature, which goes into our classification of the creek. So that's a hard question to answer, but I think that we need to look to our past and learn from people who've been on this landscape for a long time. And one of those key parts of Indigenous culture is that, you know, you're tied to the landscape and wealthy from the water. So I think in order to honor that history, I think that Missoula should go forward with honoring our streams and rivers. And I don't think that the way that we've treated Pattee Creek and continue to treat it is honoring it. So going forward, I mean, as I said, just invest in it, invest in restoration, invest in education, talk about it, and that's how I'd answer that. Yeah, thanks.
The Pattee Creek being diverted and paved over is this sort of like a miniature version of what the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers did to the Los Angeles River.
Yeah.
Which the Los Angeles River during the 1910s and 1920s, it constantly flooded.
Yeah.
Hundreds of people. So they had to pave it over. But at a very big ecological cost.
Yeah, so I mean, we're really lucky in Missoula to be complaining about this because it's such a small percentage of our landscape. Whereas if you go to any other major city, I mean, accessing a stream is, you're not going to do it. And we're super blessed to be able to, you know, think about this issue. And I think a main thing is that, as I said, you know, as we continue to develop, we have crucial decisions to make about how our landscape is going to interact with water bodies. So, I mean, we should, as I said, learn from this case study and choose different options going forward to not have places like the Los Angeles River in Missoula. Yeah.
I heard that there was some activities where people were going kind of door to door, place to place to help pull yellow flag iris and some bases, and also provide natural vegetation to take the place. So I wondered what other kinds of things might be happening, and you might know about that are attempted.
Well, as you said, I think the two main government entities that have been spearheading it has been the Conservation District and the Stormwater Utility, and they've both sponsored restoration efforts. Conservation District on that upper portion, and then Stormwater Utility on the lower portion. There's also community organizations. So the Friends of Pattee Creek is an organization that was trying to gain traction and do things like that. But I mean, yeah, so I guess at a certain point, you know, the community of Missoula just has to like take initiative, and people need to learn. And this is also a really slow process, right? So like community change is really slow, and the ball is rolling on this. And I bet you anything that in 20 years, Pattee Creek is going to look better than it did today. And I think in general, we're becoming more aware of the mistakes we've made in the past. And I think that things are changing towards the better. So those are all the specific examples of things that are happening. Maybe there's more, and hopefully just all those things have collective momentum and continue to progress in the future. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit on any potential impacts to the Bitterroot River from all this development.
I mean, well, it's tough to say because I mean the water quality data that we have is definitely not complete. So we don't know how much water is going into the Bitterroot every year. We don't know the flow rates of Pattee Creek. We don't know during a storm how much total suspended solids is entering the creek. We only have tiny little snapshots in time. So there's a lot of uncertainty for sure. But I mean, if you only had Pattee Creek as an isolated catchment, and that was all that was entering the Bitterroot River, there would be no problem at all. It's so small. What's big is our collective impact. So the entire city of Missoula and the entire urban landscape of the United States, every developed landscape has a huge impact. So you go to the bottom of the Columbia River watershed, and that river is clapped, like it's gnarly. And that's a product of all these small catchments feeding into a way bigger issue. So, I mean, Pattee Creek, it's a small stream. It's like 10 CFS, 100 CFS at flood. It's relatively small. And so I don't think that you could say that like Pattee Creek itself has a huge influence, but the cumulative impact of urban pollution on waterways is huge. I mean, the EPA says that that's the #1 threat to water quality is urban water pollution. So, but yeah, aside from TSS and phosphorus and nitrogen, things that I've talked about today, a big one would be temperature. So the temperature of urban streams is a lot hotter than non-urban streams. And that's going to continue to be a huge factor going forward, especially with climate change. So that's why I said green infrastructure and low impact development can help curtail that. We also have heavy metals, hydrocarbons, all sorts of things coming out of urban development. So yeah, and then the Bitterroot feeds into the Clark Fork, and there's big consequences. So yeah.
Was there anything that was especially surprising with all the research you did, or was all the data collection kind of just confirming what you'd expect as far as correlation with?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that my master's research took a much different track than a lot of other people. So when I was working for the city, I've been looking at this data for 3 years, and I've been like thinking about this for a long time. So in a lot of ways, I kind of knew what the story was before I started. Obviously, I was still impartial to the data when I was analyzing it, but yeah. And so to answer your question, before I wrote everything, I kind of knew what the story was, and the story is what interested me. Like, I think just how Pattee Creek came to be is the thing that was surprising me the most when I was at the confluence and I was seeing that sediment latent discharge, and I was seeing all the trash, and I was living in Missoula, which is like a hydrologically aware community, and which is great. And we do a lot of things really great, but I was just surprised that not a lot of people were talking about this. And also it's hard to know about because it's underground, right? So those are the things that surprised me. Yeah. Yeah, Lindsay.
Did you get the upper watershed monitoring, like data from?
Yeah, so there were 5 sites in total on Pattee Creek. 2 of them were from the county. Those are the upper reaches. And then on Rattlesnake Creek and Grant Creek, they're all from the county.
And do you have any opinions on the way their methods of monitoring versus others?
No, not really. I mean, it would be great if there was more coordination and there was more parameters that matched up. So the reason that I included only those 3 parameters was mainly because those are the only 3 parameters that are gathered by all those entities. So the stormwater utility looks at like oil and grease and a bunch of other things, and then the county looks at a bunch of other things. So I could only pick 3 that. So I guess my one complaint would be like maybe try to like do the same ones. But overall, I mean, both entities do such great work. Like I can't complain. And also the employees that work for those entities were super helpful with giving me data, including you. So thank you. But also Calvin with the county. And yeah, super grateful for all the help.
So you're not gonna complain?
No complaints. No. Yeah. Or you, yeah.
Monitoring for the salt and
I think that the county is. I talked to Todd about it, and he said that there was some data on chloride and salt, but I don't know. I'm not sure. I haven't really looked into that much. Yeah, Deb, you have a question?
Thinking about the jurisdiction issue at the Rick Chamber.
Yeah.
If Pattee Creek were more restored, would Rick Chamber and daylight and brought back to more of a natural.
Yeah.
Would it change the jurisdiction? Inroad into giving as a creek.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it would be a domino effect because if you had, I mean, if the creek looked like a creek, more people would, be concerned about that classification. So I think if restoration did occur, things would change. Yeah. And I think it could happen both ways too, right? So I think the classification could change and then more restoration would be inspired. So I think those two things are tied together and overlap. Yeah, and I mean, I've thought a lot about that question and it's complicated and everyone has a different opinions and, it's reasonable to consider it not a creek because it doesn't look like one. What I make an argument in my thesis is that, the words that we use really matter. And if we say it's a creek, we refer to it as such, then maybe we'll manifest it being a creek. So I say that in a hopeful aspiration way. Yeah, but it meets the definition because a creek is a perennial tributary of a river, and Pattee Creek is a creek. Okay, yeah.
Are fish able to navigate the parts that are underground?
No.
So that population of trout in the upper part that's considered a creek is essentially isolated.
That's correct. Yeah, so
that could potentially be why they're so genetically pure.
Yeah, so the pipe that leaves the grit chamber up there and feeds the 16-inch diameter gravity main, there's a concrete box that water falls into. So not only would the fish have to swim up miles of pipe, but then they would have to jump no, they can't. Yeah. So anything above that is isolated. Yeah.
Why didn't you recycle your beer can? So I have 2 questions. One just popped into my head. There's goldfish in Bancroft Pond. Then is there a fish screen, on the end of that so that these goldfish? I'm sure there must be some mechanism to keep the goldfish from getting flushed out.
I've never seen one.
There's got to be something because it's like crawling.
Well, it goes dry.
I've never seen a fish screen. I've looked all over that.
Some sort of, I guess they would go in the cattail right now?
No, they wouldn't, because Cattail Corner is it feeds Pattee Creek, so it's above.
It doesn't connect. It won't.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was one question I had, and the other was kind of piggybacking off of Vicky's comment where she mentioned people losing their agricultural water rights. I mean, it's pretty developed now, but we have all sorts of little backyard farmers in the Orchard Homes area, people who just live on a block and have a water right for the ditch and fight to have it taken away from them. Did you come across? Is there anybody on that lower stretch of Pattee Creek that has a water right and is doing any sort of whatever?
Yeah, there are. One interesting example of that is a lawyer's office. There's a law office right about here, and when that pipe was put in, the city did not talk to the lawyer's office, and they piped their water, and then shortly after, not surprisingly, the lawyer sued the city and said, "You just put in that expensive pipe in the middle of the road and cut off my water right. You have to rip it up." So they went in and ripped it up and put a pipe that's like shooting off. Just like shoots off the main line and feeds their water. That's the only one I know of. I'm sure that there's just like countless water rights issues.
Found that lawyer at the time.
And therefore
Yeah.
the creek looks great.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that they did it. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, it keeps water on the surface.
Is all that data, the nitrogen, dissolved solids, and phosphorus, is that from like a remote sensing station, or are people going out there all the time and testing those, and how often is that?
People are going out and testing it, and I'm trying to think if I have that data on the table. I don't think I do, but the different sampling efforts are have different frequencies. So the stormwater utility has been sampling along Pattee Creek since 2016. The water quality district has been sampling around the area since 2019. So the stormwater utility data goes back a little further. On those water quality slides, I showed the amount of data points for each one. Pattee Creek has more data compared to the other ones. So those are people going out with a water sample container and collecting the samples, putting it in a cooler, and then shipping it off to a company to look at the data, or bringing it to the Missoula wastewater treatment plant where people in the lab there were processing measurements. So it's all hands on the ground. I'd say on average, we have 4 or 5 measurements from each site from each year since it started. So since 2019, each site has been sampled like 4-ish times a year. Yeah. Sweet. Yeah.
I'm curious how Pattee Creek is used to regulate water levels.
Yeah.
I knew that it goes into Bangkok Pond and then.
Yeah.
Sometimes that pond is completely dry.
Yeah. Yeah, so the channel that feeds Bancroft Ponds is controlled by a gate. So that gate has a wheel at the top of it, and it's very scientific. It has a piece of, is it still a piece of duct tape? Yeah, so it's like a piece of duct tape, and you pull a wheel, and once the wheel gets to a certain point on the tape, that means that the channel is X amount open. So depending on how much water's in the pond and how much water's in the channel, it's open to a certain degree. So it's someone's job at the city to go out and like manually turn that wheel at the seams. And so right now it's flowing because it's warm right now, but usually in late February it would be closed because they close it in the winter for ice dams, because if that channel is so small and there's those bridges right there that in the winter ice will build up and flow over. So it fluctuates between being on and off. And I mean, Pattee Creek is a really small stream, and a lot of times in late August, there's just like not that much water coming out of it either. Talking to one of the city employees who's been here for a long time. He's had like a couple summers. He's so funny. He's like, I have to go out and water the ducks. And he puts because there's no water coming down Pattee Creek sometimes, and he puts a fire hydrant hose on and waters the Bancroft ponds via that. He's awesome. Yeah, he has all types of crazy stories of Pattee Creek, but yeah. All right. Sweet. Thank you so much.
Real quick before I let you guys all head out, I completely forgot to mention this earlier, and Carver kind of reminded me unintentionally. So this is actually the 20th anniversary of the Watershed Education Network becoming a nonprofit. Right, that's awesome. Yeah. And funnily enough, we actually made a video in 2004, 20 years ago, on Bancroft Pond and Cattail Corner. So it's a very early 2000s video. Style is beautiful.
It's so good.
It's
I
wonderful.
cannot tell you how good it is.
And it's all been on VHS tapes at our office. So that tells you a little bit more about it. But it's a 3-part kind of mini movie thing, about an hour and a half total. They were slowly digitizing, updating. Our director, Deb, put a very nice intro to it. And so we're slowly putting that up onto our YouTube. So if you are ever interested in learning more about Cattail Corner and Bancroft Pond, about the fish, the mammals, the environment, just all aspects of it, you can kind of check that out. It's a very beautiful, beautiful video. So, yeah.